Welcome to our third edition of Branding on a Budget, a 5-part training webinar series brought to you by the one and only United Way of Northern Utah, KB Grants, and Ogden Downtown Alliance. My name is Danielle and this is Haley, and we're very excited to have you here. If you haven't been able to join us for our previous 2 presentations, they are available on United Way of Northern Utah's webpage, and we will link that in the chat box for you guys. Today we are very excited to be talking about utilizing public influence, and you might be wondering why we're wearing Weber State University hoodies. That's because we are proud alumni, and we are super excited to have Allison Hess joining us today to talk about public relations. She is Weber State University's Public Relations Director, and she was Haley's professor, and so she holds a special place in our heart, and we're excited for you to hear more from her.
So before we really dive in, per usual, if you've watched our past 2 videos, we always like to start with definitions to kind of lay the groundwork for what we will be talking about. So first, I want to define what is public relations, or as you'll probably hear us refer to it, PR, which is the abbreviation for the rest of this video. So the Public Relations Society of America defines public relations as a strategic communication process that builds mutually beneficial relationships between organizations and their publics. And just a nice little plug also, public relations is earned. I know sometimes you might get public relations confused with advertising and or marketing. A lot of those words are used frequently together in the same sentence often, but public relations is the free media or like blogger influencer relations side of that, not to be confused with marketing, which is what is owned by you and your organization, and advertising, which is what you pay for, and Danielle will kind of get into that a little bit later. And you might be wondering, why is public relations important? And public relations really helps to build visibility and also credibility in your organization. So it's very, very important for you and your nonprofit or your local business to have public relations and to be practicing that. And also public relations just allows you to be creative. And I think that that is something, especially for myself, that drew me to this career path, was that there was a lot of room for a personal touch and for being unique and getting creative. So don't be afraid to think outside the box and to try new things with your public relations efforts. And so there are 3 different ways to create public relations. One is persuasion, to get buy-in or to make connections or strengthen connections, and also like with the media and then with the public in that realm, and then also like to tug at the heartstrings and really add that personal touch. And 2 would be storytelling or creating a narrative, and then 3, building awareness around something or about something. So when you're working in public relations, and to bring it back to the topic of today's what are we calling this? Training. Why did I almost just say lecture?
It's because Allison
I know. I'm just so frazzled. No, I'm kidding.
We are university minded at the moment.
Right? In the theme of today's training, when you're utilizing public influence, you really will be collaborating directly with people like journalists, reporters, other communications directors, other communications professionals, etc. So really put yourself into their mindset and into their shoes and ask yourself what they are looking for. And they are looking to create news. And so kind of the 2 ways that you can do that, or the things to be thinking about, are creating a story or following a story. So are you giving them a little bit of information that they can then take and create a fun story around? Or are you providing them with updates as a story or a project unfolds?
And when we're talking about reaching the public and in using these PR pieces to gain their help, and that's why we kind of called it utilizing public influence. So in order to do that, you need to make relationships with key media people in your area, in your state, in your sphere, whether you're a nonprofit organization, a business, if your focus is on like outdoor activities or arts, really figuring out who those people are, and then starting to build a media list. And so you want to include some simple information such as their name, their job, their company, who they represent, their email, phone number, any additional comments about the person. You want to make sure to keep a space for this because you can keep track of who you've worked with in the past. And then you can also kind of keep some of those personal details that you might get from working with them that you can utilize later on to kind of connect with them easier and gain their attention more. And then when you're sending them your press releases, you want to create a really solid press release. And so I will put up a graphic that will help break this down. But you want to include your logo, something that visually grabs their attention and they immediately recognize who you are. You want to include your release date, your contact information, a headline, something catchy, something that'll grab their attention, but also gives kind of a little sneak peek into what you're going to be sharing. A subheader, so that kind of gives a little bit more details, but again, not too much. A date line to start into your intro paragraph. And then your intro paragraph, you want it to have kind of a fun overview, maybe a few key highlights. And then, 1 or 2 body paragraphs and 1 or 2 related quotes if you can. And then you're going to want to include in those body paragraphs a schedule if you have it, a few more key highlights, or if you have like a special presenter or a special performance, you want to include some of those. And this is a great time to announce those pieces if you haven't already announced them. And then you want to do a conclusion line where you can go to get more information about this event, and then a boilerplate. So the boilerplate kind of separates the ending, and you want to include underneath that breakup, you want to include your business or organization name, and then the description, or in a nonprofit situation, you want to include your mission statement. Some of the attachments you want to include is going to be like photographs are huge. If you have photographs from the previous years of this event showing what's so exciting about it, or even if you're bringing in a presenter or a musician or something like that, you can share pictures that they have that they can then use easily to transition into a print story or a TV story. And with digital B-roll is always good, so some live footage if you have it. And then you want to include a PDF and a Word version of your press release. And then anything else that might be helpful, any other links or anything that you think of that might be helpful for those specific media outlets. Now, when we're talking about the email body, the most important thing I think is making it personalized and individualized. And so that's why I said before, if you've worked with some of these people in the media before, you want to make sure you keep those connections, but you want the subject line to catch their attention. So a lot of the times, especially with like TV, for example, they're getting 1 million emails a day, right? So they're going to go through the subject lines quickly, and they're going to weed through, and they're going to pick the ones that catch their eye. And so you want your subject line to be catchy, funny if you can, creative, random, but also give a little bit of information about exactly what you're going to be covering, so that you're not, wasting anybody's time if it's not something that's related. And then include, like I said, some ideas for interviews, and also maybe even their contact information if you have it. And then you want to include in the body the links to the Facebook or the event page, so that they can easily just press it and go to it, and they don't have to try and search it or look it up themselves. And then you want to copy the press release body straight into the email at the end of your personal lines. And then I would say give it like a week, and then send some follow-up emails, giving them some more ideas for interviews and coverage and some more options. That way, especially if it's like last minute, they can just slip that into their schedule, and they're like, okay, well, this person already included graphics, they included B-roll, they have everything ready to go. So I can easily take this whole like PR package and make it into some media coverage. I don't even have to stress it.
Now we are going to talk a little bit more about public relations on digital platforms, specifically with email lists and then creating newsletters. So for email lists, we really highly recommend using some sort of managing platform. Obviously, there are several out there and everyone has their preferences. 2 that we've worked with before are MailChimp and Constant Contact. And these are very helpful because it really allows you to just keep track of your audiences and who your audiences are, who's in each, and then you can also segment those out even further. So for example, we at the Ogden Downtown Alliance use MailChimp, and we have kind of a catch-all audience that is our OTA at-large email and newsletter update list. But then within that at-large list, we have segments for each of our districts. So Historic 25th Street has their own segment, the Junction, 9 Rails Creative District, and then Washington Boulevard. So if there's something that's more specific to a certain group of people, we can send that directly to them. Or if it's like a construction update or an event happening, that can go to everyone. So that's just a way to really stay organized and then to be mindful about who you are communicating with. And then you can use those audiences and those segments to send out your email blasts. You can schedule out reminders or updates, even weekly, monthly, however you need to do that. And then of course your newsletters, and definitely be cautious when you're planning your email updates about under messaging or over messaging. And this is something that Allison talks a lot about in her interview that's coming up next. So she has a lot more to say from her own personal experience and professional experience, but definitely be mindful about how much you're communicating. If you're doing too much or not doing enough, just make sure that you're mindful about the words that you're using, if it's on brand for your organization, and if it's relevant to the audiences that you're trying to reach. And we actually are going to talk more about that next month during our training on engaging diverse audiences with Stacy Bernal. So definitely tune into that, where we'll talk about how to engage with those audiences and make sure that you're really hitting the mark with that. But next, once you are communicating with your audiences on these platforms, I know we talked about newsletters and we're going to talk about it again. So we do recommend using a platform, perhaps MailChimp, or I know we mentioned in our last training, Adobe Spark, things like that. And these are just ways to put together those email updates in a really nice, eye-catching, clean layout, on-brand way. So definitely make sure that you're including that visual content and that you're also including any links and attachments to direct people either back to your website or wherever they need to go for more information about your event or your mission or whatever the update is about. And then again, just making sure that your content is relevant to your audiences.
So there are 4 types of media. So it is kind of overwhelming, and Haley kind of mentioned this in the beginning about the differences between marketing and PR and advertising and how a lot of people get those confused. I know I did when I was first starting out, and so it's been really helpful to understand the 4 types, and that's owned, paid, earned, and shared. So owned would be things that your organization or your business specifically owns. That's yours. So if you send out a newsletter, your email list, your social media account, things that you can utilize that you own. Paid would be, and this is where we go back to the idea of advertising. So paid advertising are these contracts that you have with billboard, print, radio, TV, those kinds of outlets where you are paying to have your message put out the way you want it. Earned is PR, so talking about sending out these press releases and earning coverage. So you're gaining their interest and they're coming and they're sharing your story. And then shared, so social media, word of mouth, and utilizing that public influence. If you have a local influencer, things like that, those all count as shared media. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about the difference between advertising and public relations, because I think those are the 2 that get the most overlap. So the biggest difference is, like I said, advertising is paid and public relations is earned. So advertising builds exposure and public relations builds trust. So your audiences might be a little bit more skeptical with an advertisement because they know it's paid for. Whereas with public relations, you're essentially getting that third-party validation to let people know, like, oh, this is a good product or this is a good organization and we're covering it because we were interested in it. And it's a little bit more genuine that way. Advertising is guaranteed. You know, you're paying for that spot, you're paying for that time. Whereas public relations, there's no guarantee. It's kind of all hands in the air. If there's 4 or 5 different events going on around the same time, you never know if you're going to be able to get that coverage, and you have to persuade the media to cover yours. With advertising, you have complete creative control, and I think that is one of the hardest things about public relations is the media is controlling the final version of whatever it is you're giving out. With advertising, you can create your graphic and you can create your words that you want people to read, but with public relations, it can be twisted, it can be changed, it can be misinterpreted even, and so you have a little bit less say over that. And with that being said, advertising is more visual, whereas public relations uses a lot more verbal language, so that's something to keep in mind. Again, advertising is more expensive, whereas public relations is less expensive because you're not paying for it and you're earning it. And I'll just leave you with one last thought. So essentially just ask yourself, am I buying this or am I sharing this out because it's important and somebody else is going to come cover it? So those are kind of the questions to ask, and the differences between the two.
So now that you know all of that information, we're going to get into everyone's favorite thing, which is tracking and reporting. You've put all of this effort into something and you want to know if it's paying off. So again, we both recommend using some sort of tracking or reporting platform, and one that we are going to plug is Meltwater, that we have worked with in the past for large events, and then our friends next door here at OTA Visit Ogden use them more so on a yearly basis just to track overall coverage. And so Meltwater is a media monitoring software for both public relations and then also for advertising. So what you could do with a platform like this is pull yearly lists about links or titles, authors, outlets that have covered your organization or events related to your organization or local business. Basically, anytime that you've been covered or mentioned, this platform, this software will bring up and let you know. So you can see when it was talked about, who was talking about it, and where, and then you can kind of say, oh, okay, and look at the patterns for that, and maybe plan for the next time you do that event or the next event you have coming up or your next year. And that's also really nice if you have board level participation or things like that. You can report on those numbers to your boss, to your board, or whomever, or even just to the public to say, look how awesome we are and look at all this coverage that we are getting. So definitely we recommend platforms and tools for measuring your reach. And if you're wondering more about that, or if you have any other questions, I know we just gave a lot of information, make sure to throw those questions in the chat box below, because up next we have our interview, but then after that we have our live Q&A with Allison, and she is the master. So if you have anything that you want to ask her about any of this, I'm sure she would love to provide her input. But right now we wanted to leave you with a little action item after our training. So we really just want to challenge everyone to take a minute after today and create a media list for their organization or local business, whoever you're with that you're joining us from. Really identify those local media platforms and partners and those different creative avenues for you to communicate your organizational happenings. So think about that. If you have questions about that, chat box below or ask us in the live Q&A at the very end. But right now we are going to get into our interview with Allison Hess.
Welcome, everybody, and we are live from our own homes and joined by Allison Hess, the Public Relations Director at Weber State University. Hi, Allison.
Hi there. So nice to be with you.
We're so lucky to have you. And how long have you been at Weber State University?
Well, I began at Weber State University as an adjunct professor, clear back like a long time ago. And I was just teaching one night a week, and then it was so much fun, and students seemed to enjoy the relationship we had. And so the department encouraged me to get a graduate degree so that I could take a full-time position. So in 1997, I became a full-time professor in the Department of Communication. Haley might actually remember
Yep.
a class with me, which was fantastic. I taught in the department for a number of years, advised the student newspaper, loved that experience. Then about 10 years ago, a little more, the opportunity to do public relations for an institution that I loved, could feel very confident about representing, became available. And I thought, well, that'll kind of complete because I began as a reporter, then I worked as a teacher, and then I moved to public relations. It's like a full service communication career.
We have a few questions for you. And just for those of you watching and listening, please remember, if there's any questions that pop up in your mind throughout this interview, go ahead and drop them in the chat and we'll address them at the end. Allison will be joining us for a live Q&A at the end. So just keep that in mind. So I guess just to start off, something simple, what does a day at work look like for you?
Well, I thought maybe versus talking about what a single day looked like, what I wanted to talk about maybe to kind of give an idea of what I work on a regular basis. I talk about some of the major projects that I'm engaged in right now. So as anybody in Northern Utah, and particularly Ogden, knows, that the Ogden Bus Rapid Transit is coming soon, and we'll have stops from McCady Hospital all the way to front runner station, and we'll have 3 at Weber State University. So that's been, we are starting construction here. So it's important. I've been working on messaging to campus. We've sent out announcements. We've posted posters and flyers. We've put information on electronic boards. We included it in our faculty and staff newsletter. Everything we can do to let our internal campus stakeholders know that we've got a bus system being built right through the center of our campus, and we want to make sure they're aware. We are also I've also been working on a virtual digital video, and it's a really cool video that UTA BRT produced that shows what virtually it will look like if you're on a bus and you're riding through campus. It's a gorgeous video, but it came without any sound to it. So then I suggested, and we worked on adding some tags, some graphic tags, so you knew where you were and what you were looking at. So you didn't need anybody to talk you through while you were watching this video. You could just read, oh, this is what our central campus station is going to look like. So I wanted to make sure that looked just right before we rolled it out. We also, at Weber State, in just a couple of days, have our commencement coming up. And of course, that's all kinds of planning and preparation and messaging. We didn't hold a commencement, as you may be aware, in December. So now all 6,000, a record number of graduates, are going to be attending our events. We have a virtual commencement for our record number of graduates, 6,000 plus, to watch. But then the following 2 days, we'll have in-person events in the Stewart Stadium for each college, where each student can walk, receive his or her diploma, get cheered on by their family and friends. Weber State, in combination with Weber Morgan Health, has been hosting a vaccine clinic in the D-Event Center. And many days, often, where I'm involved in one aspect or another of either messaging or planning or getting the word out on that. I'm the primary producer of 6 newsletters specifically intended for our faculty and staff that go out every year. So six per year. Just put the last one to bed on that. And then finally, we send out about 100 news releases a year from Weber State University. So if there are 54 weeks in a year, that means on average, it's a small team of us, but I oversee it. We're sending 2 news releases a week. Of course, there are other things that come up too, but those are things I touch every single day right now.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a busy schedule, but also very rewarding. And I know that you mentioned earlier that you were excited to have a public relations job for an institution that you were so proud to work at. So what are some things to be mindful of when you're writing public messaging on behalf of an institution or an organization?
The times we've been most successful, and I've been most successful, is when you get all the appropriate stakeholders in the creation and the delivery of the message. When you're all together, your team is together, and you have all the perspectives, you think about all of the angles, and you come together and you agree on the message. Then I think the next thing you really need to be careful is that your message is accurate, that you're getting out the correct information, you're being very honest. I think one thing that we have to be careful of is both over messaging and under messaging. It gets to the point, I'm sure you have email fatigue from COVID and the organizations you work with. Mm-hmm. You send so many messages that people stop looking at them. Mm-hmm. But then not having enough messages, not letting your stakeholders know what's going on, what's happening, what to expect. So that's kind of a fine balance as we're thinking of our messaging.
You mentioned like newsletters, but then also Instagram. So do you have any tips on how to keep a cohesive voice when you're crossing so many different platforms constantly?
I do think that that's where, if you are all coming together to begin with on your message, so that yes, every group is taking its delivery form to deliver it, but you have the cohesive message that you've crafted from, we refer to it as big W, the big W message, and then we parse it out in different ways to different groups, and then they send it using the tools that they have.
So one of the questions that we've been getting a lot about is the difference between email lists, like newsletter subscribers, and media lists, and how do you differentiate between those two when you're building them?
Well, honestly, when we write a news release, one of those 100 news releases we write each year, I know that's a lot, but we write them as stories. I almost consider our small group as our own news organization, and we're telling our own story that is both appropriate to send to the media, but it's also appropriate to anybody who's interested in the institution. So we actually have a list of about 200 people, both traditional media and what you would call newsletter subscribers, and we send all our news releases to all of them.
To kind of touch back on the media list portion, who should you include when you are building out a media list for your organization? And then kind of like a piggyback question off of that, like how would you identify those different audiences?
I really think it requires you as a PR person, us as PR people, to be really vigilant on what's going on in Utah media. There's just frankly a lot less of it right now. So I think it's important to know every possible outlet you can possibly find, and find the specialties of those reporters, and then have them at the ready. And then when the news release applies to that reporter, that you can reach out to them specifically. So certainly I know the environmental reporters and the business reporters, and I am making sure that they are getting my releases. But honestly, with the limited media we have, I think it's not that hard to really build a media list that includes all the media, print, radio, and television and I'm assuming this group is generally geared toward northern Utah.
That's great. I feel like I know you're obviously the expert in all things press releases. So we just wanted to know a little bit more about like what you feel is good to include when you're reaching out to media outlets, and what to include in your press release, how much detail, depth should you go into, and kind of that formatting.
Well, if you don't mind, I would like to share my screen with you and just give you maybe a few tips of things that I've learned or have experienced in writing news releases. But one thing that, you can't go without mentioning is that media relations is really what I consider it is the goodwill garnered without spending money. So a lot of successful public relations, media relations is done by building good relationships, even, all the time, so that in times of stress, you have a really good working relationship. Now, another thing I like to keep in mind, or I think we need to keep in mind when you're writing a news release, is first of all, you need to know the deadlines, which from the time I started in this industry to now, when you're working in it, has really quite changed. In the olden days, we used to have the noon news, and we had the 6 o'clock news, and we had the 10 o'clock news. Well, now deadlines really are 24/7, especially with social media. So deadlines are really constant. So that might not be as much importance to a young public relations professional as it was back, say 10 or 15 years ago. But this part has really held true still. When you're thinking of what's going to make the news, there are just generally 6 broad topics of interest that media look at to say, should we do that story? Does the story have impact? Is it impacting a lot of people? Or is it impacting a few people, but very, very intensely? So I always say, the price of stamps go up. It only goes up 2 cents, but it impacts all of us. And or, perhaps someone dies or some other event like that. It doesn't impact as many people, but it impacts them profoundly. Conflict is also a marker of news. So whenever you're doing a story that involves some conflict, whether I think athletics actually falls in that, but it also is, people versus nature or conflicts of opinion. Whenever there's conflict, media is interested. Stories that are novel, different, unusual. Also, if there's someone prominent involved in the story, or if it's happening close to you. And of course, media are also always looking for timely stories. So then, really, in a news release, I think the thing that you have to remember is it needs news. News releases aren't advertising. I mean, we share information about our organization, but we only use news releases if there's actually news to the release, not and news as defined by one of those 6 categories we just talked about. Of course, you'll want to have your own style guide. Generally, if you don't use anything else, use the Associated Press style guide. So we use Associated Press because that's what newspapers use. And then we augment with our own style guide. And if you want to look at Weber's, you can just look at weber.edu/brand/style guide. You can see it there on the screen. And that gives you generally we follow AP, and then we just have a few additional guidelines that help us every time we write a news release. I think it's important in your news releases to have, I like having a quote from the source. So meaningful quotes bring heart, humor, humanism. A good quote shouldn't be just a recitation of facts. So here's a quote that I really liked. We had a set of twin brothers who are still attending school here at Weber State. They were victims of shaken baby as babies. They're both legally blind, and yet they're both successfully going to school. So one of their advisors in the diversity center wrote this about them. To me, that's the kind of quote that just makes you say, "Oh, I want to talk to her about them." It makes you understand how loved they are by the people who work with them. News releases we write in short sentences and short paragraphs, generally one idea per sentence, no more than 3 sentences per paragraph for sure. We want to provide the who, what, when, where, why, how, and occasionally, if you can, the so what. So here's something that here's just a simple lead to a story, news release that I thought kind of captured the information and hopefully answered some of that who, what, when, where, why, how. Weber State University's Empower Northern Utah program is helping Weber and Davis County residents to be more energy efficient by offering steep discounts on the Nest Thermostat E, while also providing free LED light bulbs in exchange for old, inefficient bulbs. You capture the who, what, when, where, why, how. You try and write it in a sentence that's less than about 26 seconds. And hopefully the so what is wound in there, that you're letting. Why is this important? Because Weber County residents will get more efficient light bulbs and thermostats. So generally, I just write my leads very straightforward. Who, what, when, where, why, how, first sentence. Because I think newsrooms are getting hundreds of news releases a day. You don't have the luxury of thinking they're going to read very deep into your news releases. You need to get out there and, you need to give them the news right away. However, once in a while, I've had just this much fun where we said the lead was a Master of Business Administration degree usually focuses on how to earn money, But students in Weber State University's leadership course learned how to give money away effectively and for impact. So that was my lead sentence. But then immediately moved into the who, what, when, where, why, how. Mike Vaughn, economics professor, gave his MBA students $1,000 each so that they could give it to a nonprofit organization. And then I listed the organizations that received money. I think in news releases, one thing that's important to do is include information and photos, and videos that are not easily accessible to reporters. For example, commencement. It was in the evening. It's like 7 o'clock at night, either Friday or Saturday. Very few reporters or photographers are on staff. So we just provided them the photos. If they couldn't make it, here are the gorgeous photos. And we did receive pickup on those photos from several organizations. And then, of course, you'll want to, don't forget the contact information. Make sure you are giving them numbers and information where they can reach you when they want to reach you. But when we're depending on them to tell our story, we also have to be generous with our time and giving them information. Those are just some basic tips on writing a news release.
Those are all perfect. And thank you for the little mini presentation. So kind of the next step in that, so you've sent out the news release and then someone's interested, they want to come to your event or come to your organization or talk more about that. What tips do you have for scheduling with the media for on-site coverage or interviews? And how can people kind of be prepared for those situations to make the most of it?
I think you need to be really aware of what visuals are going to be in the background. Where are you going to have them here, at your organization, so that it's visually appealing, that you'll have great audio, and make sure that they have a parking pass and good directions on how to get to, where you're going to be. Make sure you're there to greet them, and maybe you're on the cell phone with them. What I often do is, hey, you don't know our campus very well. Here's my cell phone number. Call me 10 minutes in advance, park at the information booth, and I'll walk out and meet you there. And then from the parking, then we will walk together to the building where they're going. And then at that building, I make sure that my sources are there, that they're prepared, that I'm not holding up the media, that I am ready to go. If I can get them there, I don't want to waste their time, not even a moment of it. I want to make sure. And then one other thing that I always make sure I have is another story idea. So I have them here for a few minutes, and I'm going to tell them all about what's going on, but I'm going to also say, oh, and by the way, next week, next month, we're doing another cool thing and you might be interested in it. Mm-hmm. I never want to be caught flat-footed when they say, anything else going on? Yeah. Oh, I don't know. Oh, gosh. No, I have a lot of great things that are going on all the time.
So a question that I had was, how do you prepare yourself to talk about hard or controversial topics on behalf of an organization, on behalf of the university, and what advice would you have on preparing those kinds of statements?
I'm just going to tell you that's hard.
Yeah.
I wish I could tell you it's easy. Here are some things. One is, again, it helps to have buy-in from the people that you're speaking for and on behalf of. So make sure your top administrators are completely on board with the points that you're going to make. Then have 2 or 3 points in mind that you want to pivot back to and reiterate over and over. I think a key tip, and frankly, it's one I've learned from hard experience and haven't always followed through myself, is to practice beforehand. Get 2 or 3 of your close colleagues, get them in the room, have them ask you those questions, and force yourself to answer them. Because I found that I can answer them in my head. Oh, I am fantastic. And then when I actually go to answer them out loud, they don't roll off the tongue in quite the same way. An example, an example was we had an NCAA violation and we got a sanction. And within like 20 minutes, I had 5 TV cameras in front of me. And I'm going to tell you, it wasn't my best effort. I mean, I pulled it off and it worked out, but it wasn't quite as smooth as I would have liked. Later in the day, one camera from a station that hadn't been there earlier came, and guess what? I was brilliant. I'm just kidding. But it just sounded, it was just smooth and it went really well and everything rolled off my tongue. And it was simply that I had practiced in essence. And then when I did it with the second camera, it was just went great. So don't make the mistake I did and do your practice in front of that first set of 5 cameras. Do that one in front of your colleagues, and then do the one in front of your, and then do it really smoothly in front of your, the camera. The other thing is don't ever, and okay, I'm just telling you from all the mistakes I've made, all right? And there have been many. I've had a long career. I've had the opportunity to make a lot of mistakes. Don't have anything in your hand. I tried not too long ago. I had some of my talking. I was just holding my, I just had my talking points in my hand. Well, guess what? When they're in your hand, guess what you want to do? You want to look down at your talking points. You do not have the power and the credibility unless you can look right at that person you're talking to and say, listen to me. I believe this. We need to know this. You need to do this, or whatever. You need to have the power of your conviction comes from being able to have it just roll right off of your tongue, right out of your head, and you say it firmly and with conviction, and not looking down at your notes like, oh yeah, and then I'm going to say that, So anyway, that's another thing that I like to do. Another thing I might just suggest, honestly, I see it done a lot. Organizations just print up a typed statement and they send it along. It's not a no comment, but you're not also running some of the risks that you might run by having the TV camera show up. I'm not going to say that's sometimes the right choice to make too. This is what we have to say. Here it is.
Mm-hmm. So some of the people on this call are from nonprofits, some are local business owners, and everything in between, and their skill levels vary as well. So what are some final, general advice pieces or tips that you could share about beginner level public relations practices to implement that anyone can do no matter their skill set or knowledge level?
Well, I think because let's go back to the idea that public relations is the goodwill garnered without spending money. The way you do that is with networking and with generally liking people and with networking. So I think an important thing to do as a beginner PR person is really get to know your community. That includes your media, your stakeholders, and every person that you can, make them your friend. And I keep a really robust list. I think Weber State, the thing they'll miss about me very most is my cell phone, because I have in that cell phone contact numbers for everyone. And I'm constantly building on that list, and I use that constantly. So, and then I think it's important to be honest. It's important to be accurate. And of course, as you're writing and representing your organization, take the time to have somebody else look at your words. Make sure you're copy editing. Don't send anything that doesn't represent your best self. And then I guess, and it's part of maybe where I started here, is have fun. Enjoy the people that you get to associate with, and enjoy the organization that you represent. Believe in that organization, and that will go a long way to helping you be successful.
But thank you again, Allison, so much for joining us today. I know I learned a lot from hearing from you. I wish I could have taken one of your classes at Weber State while I was there. But we really appreciate your time today and for joining us. And for those of you that are still watching the presentation, Allison's going to be joining us live for a Q&A. So go ahead, if you have any final questions, drop them in the chat box and we will be back with you shortly.